3:19 a.m. The Bekaa Valley, Lebanon, 33 degrees north latitude, 36 degrees east longitude. The launch site had been operational since 2019. To overhead imagery, it appeared as an agricultural storage complex, a series of concrete structures surrounded by irrigated fields, connected to the main road by a dirt track, too narrow for any vehicle heavier than a delivery truck. The concrete structures were real. The irrigation was real. The delivery truck track was real. What the imagery had not shown was the tunnel network running 18 meters below the field surface, connecting a central arming chamber to 6 separate launch apertures concealed beneath trapdoors in the field itself. The trapdoors were covered with growing soil. The soil grew actual crops. The complex had been engineered to be invisible to the specific collection systems that the United States and Israel had been using to monitor southern Lebanon and the Bekaa Valley since 2006. Its designers had obtained the technical specifications of those collection systems through a procurement network that the intelligence community had not fully mapped. They had built the complex to defeat sensors whose parameters they knew. At 3:19 a.m., the trapdoors opened. Hezbollah's precision missile unit, the organization within the organization that had been trained, equipped, and advised by the IRGC's Unit 840 since 2012, activated 31 pre-prepared launch positions across southern Lebanon, the Bekaa Valley, and positions in the Syrian territory east of Damascus that had been used as a secondary staging area for the preceding 4 months. The weapons committed to the opening sequence: 94 Fateh 110 surface-to-surface missiles with GPS-aided guidance and a 500-kilogram warhead, range 300 kilometers. 47 Zelzal-3 heavy rockets with a 600-kilogram warhead, unguided but area saturation effective at their 200-kilometer range against large fixed installations. 38 Rayad 500 missiles, a system transferred from Iran in components and assembled in Lebanon over an 18-month period, combining Fateh 110 airframe with an improved solid-fuel motor that extended its range to 500 kilometers, placing Cyprus and the eastern Mediterranean operating areas within its engagement envelope. Simultaneously, from positions in western Syria coordinated through the IRGC's Quds Force logistics chain, 27 Soumar ground-launched cruise missiles activated from 3 separate launch sites in the Damascus periphery, routing west across Syria and Lebanon toward the Mediterranean coast. Total weapons in the initial Hezbollah plus Syria package, 206. And at 3:22 a.m., the Iranian component added its weight. From the Tabriz Air Base in northwestern Iran, 9 H-6N equivalent aircraft, Iranian Air Force Tu-22M3, blinder strategic bombers modified for standoff cruise missile carriage, had been airborne since 1:47 a.m. on headings that took them northwest across Iran and into the airspace corridor north of Iraq. Each aircraft carried 2 Soumar cruise missiles configured for maritime targeting. Their routing put their release point over the airspace north of Syria, beyond the effective range of Israeli air defense systems, with their missiles routing southwest toward the eastern Mediterranean operating area of USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group. 18 additional Soumar missiles from airborne release, added to the Hezbollah land-based package and the Syrian position launches, brought the combined first-wave total to 224 weapons against 2 target categories: Israeli coastal military infrastructure and the U.S. Carrier Strike Group operating 180 kilometers west of the Lebanese coast. The strategic logic had 3 load-bearing pillars. The first was operational. The simultaneous engagement of Israeli and U.S. targets would force the defensive network to split its intercept resources between 2 geographically separated aim point zones: the Israeli coastal region, defended by Iron Dome, David Sling, and Arrow batteries, and the maritime zone, defended by the carrier group's Aegis architecture. The 2 defensive networks were linked through coordination protocols, but operated as separate engagement authorities. A saturation package designed to exceed each network's individual capacity would, in the IRGC's model, result in leakage through both. The second pillar was political. An attack that simultaneously targeted U.S. and Israeli assets would force both governments to manage their response coordination in real time, introducing the friction of alliance decision-making into what would otherwise be a unilateral U.S. military response timeline. The third pillar was the window calculation. The Israeli government's operational authorization for a military response to Hezbollah required a cabinet security consultation that historically took between 40 and 70 minutes under crisis conditions. The U.S. rules of engagement for the carrier group authorized immediate defensive action without higher authorization. But offensive strike packages against Lebanese and Syrian territory required CENTCOM authorization, and coordination with Israeli defense operations required a second authorization layer. The combined political friction was assessed at a minimum of 55 minutes for a coordinated response. The flaw in the assessment was the assumption that coordinated was a precondition for effective. The defensive networks did not need coordination to intercept. They needed sensor data and firing solutions. Those were already available. 3:19 a.m. USS George H.W. Bush Combat Direction Center. The carrier strike group had been operating in the eastern Mediterranean for 19 days under an elevated alert posture that had been in effect since a signals intelligence assessment had identified increased traffic between IRGC Unit 840 and Hezbollah's Precision Missile Command 22 days earlier. The alert had elevated the group's Aegis escort radar search posture, repositioned 2 of the 4 escorts to provide improved coverage of the Lebanon and Syria approach vectors, and placed the carrier's air wing on a 30-minute surge readiness timeline, rather than the standard 60. SBIRS detected the first launch thermal signatures at 3:19 a.m. 17 simultaneous events across the southern Lebanon launch grid, consistent with the Fateh 110's solid fuel motor ignition profile. The correlation engine had processed the signature cluster as a coordinated launch event and transmitted the notification to the carrier group, to U.S. European Command, and to the Israeli Air Force's Aerial Defense Array in 2.9 seconds. The duty tactical action officer on the George H.W. Bush received the notification at 3:19 a.m. He had been in this watch position for 4 months. He had received 23 alert activations during that period. This one produced a notification format he had not seen before in the duty cycle, the Mass Launch Indicator, reserved for events exceeding 15 simultaneous confirmed launches. The indicator had been in the system for 6 years. This was the first time in his experience it had activated in a live event rather than in an exercise. He initiated the full group defensive posture at 3:19 a.m. and had the air wing surge order transmitted 40 seconds later. The Israeli Aerial Defense Array had been in continuous operational status since the elevated alert posture had been issued 22 days earlier. The Arrow 3 battery covering the northern coastal zone acquired the first Riyadh 500 tracks at 3:21 a.m., 2 minutes after launch, as the missiles cleared their initial boost phase and entered the Arrow's acquisition envelope at high altitude. The David Sling system, optimized for the Fateh 110 and Zelzal threat band, acquired its first tracks at 3:23 a.m. Iron Dome batteries covering the Haifa and Ashdod maritime port areas, designated as the highest priority defensive positions given their role in sustaining any U.S.-Israeli coordinated maritime operation, were in full active engagement posture by 3:24 a.m. The Israeli and U.S. defensive networks were not coordinating their intercept assignments in real time. They were operating under pre-agreed deconfliction protocols that assigned geographic intercept zones to each system. Israeli systems managing the land-approaching threat bands, the carrier group managing the seaward approaching threat bands, with an overlap zone in the maritime approaches where both networks could engage and the protocols determined priority. The overlap zone was where the ROD 500 tracks routing toward the carrier were processed. The Rod 500's 500-kilometer range put the George H.W. Bush's operating position inside its engagement envelope. The Arrow 3's reach into the maritime zone extended coverage for this threat. David Sling could engage the Rod 500 in its terminal phase if the Arrow 3 missed. The carrier groups SM-3 and SM-6 covered the same tracks from the maritime side. The combined effect was a triple coverage intercept architecture against the Rod 500, not by design of any single system, but because the threat had been correctly anticipated, and the pre-positioned systems happened to create a geometry where 3 separate defensive architectures all had valid firing solutions. Of 38 Rod 500 missiles, 27 were intercepted by the combined Arrow 3, SM-3, and SM-6 layer between 3:24 a.m. and 3:31 a.m. 6 were engaged by David Sling in their terminal phase. 5 reached the inner defense perimeter against the carrier group. 3 were neutralized by PAC-3 MSE. 2 closed to CRAM range. Both were neutralized. 38 Rod 500 missiles. 0 impacted. The Fateh 110 package, 94 missiles routing toward the Israeli coastal military infrastructure, was the Israeli Defensive Network's primary engagement task. The Fateh 110's GPS-aided guidance made it a precision system against fixed targets. Specifically, the Haifa Naval Base, the Rafael Advanced Defense Systems Manufacturing Complex at Haifa, and the Israeli Air Force's Nevatim Air Base, which had been identified as the most significant fixed-wing strike platform node in the theater. These were not symbolic targets. They were selected because their degradation would reduce the quality of any Israeli air-supported response to the combined package. David Sling engaged the Fateh 110 package between 3:26 a.m. and 3:38 a.m. The system's stunner interceptor was designed specifically for the Fateh 110 threat class, a medium-range ballistic missile with limited terminal maneuver capability. Of 94 Fateh 110s, 71 were intercepted by David Sling in their mid-course and terminal phases. Iron Dome engaged the remaining 23 that entered the terminal phase below David Sling's minimum engagement altitude. 18 were intercepted by Iron Dome. 5 reached their aim point zones. 2 impacted in the Haifa port area, 1 in the commercial harbor zone, 1 in the naval facility's outer logistics area. Both caused significant structural damage to pier infrastructure. The naval base remained operational. 2 impacted in the vicinity of Nevatim Air Base, both in perimeter areas rather than runway or hardened shelter zones. Nevatim's flight operations were unaffected. 1 impacted in the Rafael complex's outer parking area, producing property damage without affecting the main production facilities. 5 impacts from 94 missiles, 94.7% intercept rate against the Fateh 110 package. The Zelzal 3 rockets were the lowest precision element of the Hezbollah package and the most area saturation-oriented. 47 unguided heavy rockets, each with a 600-kilogram warhead, were not aimed at specific military installations. They were aimed at the geographic zones around Israeli military and industrial infrastructure. The fire-for-effect layer designed to overwhelm the terminal defense systems that had been expending interceptors against the guided threat categories. Iron Dome's engagement geometry was well suited to Zelzal 3 Intercept. The system's EL/M-2084 radar could classify each incoming rocket's trajectory within seconds and generate a firing solution if the projected impact point threatened a protected zone. And critically, it could decline to engage rockets whose trajectory projected impact in open ground or unpopulated areas, conserving interceptors for the threats that required them. Of 47 Zelzal 3 rockets, Iron Dome's trajectory assessment classified 31 as requiring intercept. The remaining 16 were assessed as projecting impact in non-critical areas and were not engaged. Of the 31 engaged, 28 were intercepted. 3 impacted in protected zones, 2 in the Ashdod industrial area, and one in the Haifa residential district adjacent to a military facility. By minute 22 of the combined engagement, the United States and Israel had collectively expended $1.9 billion in interceptors across all defensive systems. The figure included Arrow 3, David Sling, Iron Dome, SM-3, SM-6, and PAC-3 MSE expenditures across both networks. It was an unprecedented combined interoperability cost, not because any single system had been overwhelmed, but because the distributed nature of the attack had simultaneously activated every layer of two separate national defense architectures for the first time in operational history. The Soumar cruise missile packages were the most geographically complex element. 27 Soumar missiles from Syrian territory routing west across Lebanon, and 18 from airborne release by the Iranian bomber package. Total 45 Soumar cruise missiles were approaching the carrier group's operating area from the northeast, routing at 50 to 150 meters altitude across the Mediterranean surface. The E-2D Hawkeye orbiting at altitude above the carrier provided the primary tracking data for the low-altitude cruise missile threat. F/A-18F combat air patrol sorties from the George H.W. Bush were already airborne and were vectored by the E-2D toward the Soumar track at 3:27 a.m. Between 3:31 a.m. and 3:44 a.m., the F/A-18F sorties engaged and neutralized 27 Soumar missiles at ranges between 40 and 140 kilometers from the carrier group. The SM-6 layer engaged 11 more in the outer perimeter. 7 reached the carrier group's inner defense zone. 5 were neutralized by ESSM and CRAM. 2 impacted. 1 struck USS Leyte Gulf, the Ticonderoga cruiser serving as the group's air defense coordinator, on her bridge wing structure. The Soumar's 400-kilogram warhead detonated on the bridge wing exterior, killing the bridge watch officer and 2 bridge crew members. The ship's combat direction center below decks was unaffected. Her propulsion was unaffected. Her VLS was unaffected. USS Leyte Gulf remained underway and was reassigned from bridge operations to Combat Direction Center Command Authority. She was combat capable. 1 struck the sea surface 11 meters from USS Barry's port side, a terminal phase altitude deviation that converted a ship impact into a near miss. The pressure detonation caused minor hull flexing. No structural breach. 3 U.S. personnel on USS Leyte Gulf were killed in action, the first U.S. combat fatalities of the engagement. The Hezbollah desperation gambit came not as a weapons reserve, but as an escalation in targeting doctrine. At 3:47 a.m., as the SBIRS picture showed the Iranian bomber package retreating to Iranian airspace, and the Syrian launch site picture showed exhausted magazines, the Hezbollah command network transmitted a second-phase targeting authorization to 2 remaining active launch positions in southern Lebanon. The authorization changed the targeting category. The second phase was not aimed at military installations. It was aimed at the port infrastructure at Ashdod and Haifa, civilian commercial facilities with no direct military function. The targeting shift was assessed by the Israeli intelligence network within 4 minutes of the transmission intercept, and the decision to engage the 2 remaining launch positions preemptively was authorized by the Israeli cabinet's emergency security session at 3:51 a.m. The fastest authorization in the cabinet's recorded history, reflecting the clarity of the intelligence picture. IAF F-35. Aircraft already airborne on combat air patrol received the targeting data for the 2 southern Lebanon launch positions at 3:52 a.m. The first Ju-39 precision munition was released at 3:54 a.m. Both launch positions were rendered inoperable by 3:57 a.m. The second phase launch authorization was never activated. The Israeli preemptive strike against the launch positions was the first kinetic action against Lebanese territory in the engagement. Its authorization had required 11 minutes from intelligence intercept to weapon impact. The IRGC's model had assessed a minimum of 40 minutes for Israeli cabinet authorization. The model had been correct about the standard authorization timeline. It had not been correct about what happens when an intelligence intercept shows explicit targeting of civilian port infrastructure. The counter-operation against Syrian launch sites and the Iranian bomber package required a bilateral coordination mechanism between US-EU COM and the Israeli Defense Forces that had been exercised twice in the preceding 14 months. At 3:44 a.m., with the Iranian Tu-22M3 package confirmed as withdrawing to Iranian airspace, the coordination channel established a joint target list covering the 3 Syrian launch sites identified during the engagement. US-EU COM authorization for strikes against Syrian targets was received at 3:58 a.m. Israeli authorization for coordinated action was concurrent. The first Tomahawk from USS Arleigh Burke, launched from the eastern Mediterranean, impacted the first Syrian launch site at 4:11 a.m. All 3 sites were engaged within 22 minutes. The Hezbollah launch infrastructure in southern Lebanon was assigned to a subsequent Israeli operational phase, whose timeline and scope were above the authorization level of the current engagement. The tunnel complexes, the agricultural concealment sites, the 31 launch positions that had been activated at 3:19 a.m. These would be addressed in a campaign whose planning was already underway. The first 60 minutes of the engagement had defined the target list. The destruction of that list would require more than 60 minutes. 4:21 a.m. USS George H.W. Bush Combat Direction Center. The Air Wing's surge operations had been generating intercept support sorties since 3:20 a.m. In 62 minutes of continuous flight deck operations, the Lincoln had launched 34 sorties, F/A-18F for cruise missile intercept, E-2D for sensor support, EA-18G for electronic suppression of the Syrian launch site radar infrastructure that had been actively emitting during the Soumar launch sequence. The ship's air wing coordinator had managed the flight deck choreography through a simultaneous ASW patrol, cruise missile intercept sorties, and suppression missions with a deck crew that had been in surge operation since 3:20 a.m. He had not lost an aircraft. He had not had a deck abort. The sortie count was 4 ahead of his surge rate projection. He filed the sortie log at 4:21 a.m. The number was a number. What it represented was 34 aircraft launches from a moving flight deck in a 62-minute window, while 2 cruise missile impacts had been processed by the ship's damage control network 290 meters aft of his position. He noted the number and moved to the next item on his status board. Time from first Hezbollah launch detection to completion of active threat intercepts over Israeli territory. 58 minutes. Time from first launch to completion of last maritime threat intercept. 52 minutes. Combined Hezbollah ER GC weapons launched. 94 Fateh 110, 47 Zelzal, 3:38, Rod 500, 27 Syrian position Soumar, 18 air-launched Soumar. Total, 224 first-wave weapons. Intercepted, 71 Fateh 110 by David Sling, 18 by Iron Dome, combined 94.7%. 28 of 31 Zelzal 3 engaged by Iron Dome, 59.6% of total Zelzal 3 launched. 38 Rod 500, 38 intercepted, 100%. 45 Soumar, 27 by F/A-18F, 11 by SM-6, 5 by ESSM and CRAM, combined 95.6%. Overall first-wave intercept rate, 89.7%. Physical impacts: Haifa port area, 2 Fateh 110, pier infrastructure damage, port operational. Haifa residential area adjacent to military facility. 1 Zelzal 3, civilian damage assessment ongoing. Ashdod industrial area, 2 Zelzal 3, structural damage, no military effect. Nevatim perimeter, 2 Fateh 110, non-runway zones, flight operations unaffected. Rafael complex outer area, 1 Fateh 110, property damage. USS Leyte Gulf, 1 Soumar bridge wing impact, 3 U.S. personnel killed, ship combat capable. USS Barry, 1 near-miss pressure detonation, minor hull stress, fully operational. U.S. personnel, 3 killed in action aboard USS Leyte Gulf. 7 additional personnel injured across the formation from blast and fragment effects. Counter-operation. All 3 Syrian launch sites engaged by Tomahawk. Hezbollah southern Lebanon launch positions 31 and 32 preemptively engaged by IAF before second phase launch sequence activated. Combined counterstrike cost, $380 million. Total engagement cost including all defensive interceptors, $2.3 billion. The combined Hezbollah IRGC package had been the most geographically dispersed multi-network engagement in U.S.-Israeli defensive cooperation history. 2 national defense architectures, operating under pre-agreed deconfliction protocols rather than real-time coordination, had simultaneously processed 224 weapons across 5 threat categories and 9 geographic approach vectors. The 3 U.S. personnel killed aboard USS Leyte Gulf were the cost of 2 missiles that had navigated through a defensive architecture that had stopped 200 others. The cost was not zero. It had never been zero in any honest model of what these engagements produce. The Israeli cabinet had authorized preemptive action in 11 minutes when the targeting picture showed civilian infrastructure in the Hezbollah second phase authorization. The IRGC's model had assessed that number as 40. The 29-minute difference between the model and the reality was the difference between a second Hezbollah salvo and 2 non-operational launch positions, 224 weapons in 62 minutes, 89.7% intercepted. The defensive networks had processed the most complex multinational, multi-system engagement in their operational history, and had held the line that mattered. The line had cost 3 people on a bridge wing at 3:44 a.m. That number would not appear in any damage assessment database. It would appear in 3 letters that would be written before the next watch rotation began.